So in the last video, I went through all of the participle forms that we have in Latin. And for this video, I'll be going through all the infinitive forms that we have in Latin. And so these are two very important charts, forms for which we'll see repeatedly in our translations in class. And the forms are kind of, they use other forms to form themselves, which will hopefully make sense at the end of this video. Okay, so for this one, can we have our key? All right, so we learned about the present active infinitive in one Latin, and the present active infinitive at the beginning, oops, see, I already made a mistake. Present passive infinitive at the beginning of two Latin. See, I was considering erasing this and starting over, but I thought, you know what? This will just make them feel like they're right in class with me as it jumps up all around. So we'll just leave it. Hopefully it's making me giggle. All right, back to pen. All right. Passive. Here we go. At the beginning of two Latin. So infinitives, as we have learned, come in two voices. They are either active infinitives or passive infinitives. Although we learned the present tense, infinitives also come in three different tenses. And we learned the perfect active last week. So now we're going to learn the last two tenses of the infinitive. The perfect tense and the future tense, just like with the participles. So the three main tenses, present, perfect, and future. So these forms, these infinitive forms, will be used to form other constructions in later chapters, primarily the indirect statement, which we're going to get to soon. And they also are used to form certain forms of the subjunctive. So this is not just a separate chart in and of itself, but it is used to form other things that we're going to learn. All right. Okay, so if you think of the participle chart that we just did not too long ago, the infinitive chart is going to use some of those forms when we get past the perfect active form. Okay, but let's review. So the perfect active infinitive, notice that there's no present up here, right? So present tense is skipped on this particular key. Okay, present tense is skipped. Okay, so the perfect infinitive comes from the third principal part when it's the active one. And then you simply add the endings S, S, E. So if we're looking at the verb duco, ducera, duxi, ductus, which again means to take or to lead, this would be the third principal part, duxi, plus SSE. Now you need to understand that a lot of textbooks and tutorials will teach this as it's the third principal part minus the I plus issa. So it obviously gets you to the same point, but that's just reinforcing that you go to a stem and add an ending and remove the stem ending that you see. So you can think about it either way, going to the third principal part, removing your I and then adding ISSE, or simply going to your third principal part and adding SSE, okay? And then the translation for this would be to have taken. Oh, and you can see I accidentally just reverse those two. So put the translation on the example line. Okay, so when we're talking about the perfect passive participle, I hinted at this in class today. Because we're on the passive side, just like with our verbs, instead of going to the third principal part for perfect passives, we go to the fourth principal part. And this is also called our perfect passive participle. What we just did in the last participle. And then in order to make it not just the participle, you add the additional verb sum esse, and you're going to add the infinitive form to make it an infinitive. So I get the lines right here. You go to ductus aum, which is our participle. And for all intents and purposes, you can just do the masculine form. A lot of textbooks will default to the masculine, or to even keep it simple, they'll actually default to the neuter, but that can get to be confusing. And then, of course, my brain always goes, well, why not the feminine? So I, by default, just always choose the first form in order, which is always the masculine singular. So our infinitive is two separate words, ductus esse, but because it's an infinitive, it's always going to start with the word to. Because it's in the perfect tense, we're going to use the perfect tense helping verb, which is have. Because it's passive, we're going to add in a form to be, and then whatever the verb means, in this instance, to take. So to have been taken is how you would translate that form. And then you can see ducta and ductum, but this won't come into play until we do chapters 44 through 47. So just as an FYI, for all points right now, we'll just keep it as the masculine singular, which your textbook does as well. Okay, so notice I used my perfect participle to form my perfect passive infinitive. And it's the exact same logic when I'm forming my two future participles. Okay, so this one is also formed from the fourth principal part, which is the same thing as my perfect passive participle, just like I did above, participle. And then you're also going to add the verb esse. But in order to form this correctly, you need to use the suffix ur added into that perfect passive participle. So for that, as our example, we get ducturus esse. So notice how this is my future active participle. And then I add esse to make it an infinitive. Now these translations are going to sound awful. Just be prepared for that. Again, just like I wrote up here, this is something that we usually see in indirect statement when we get to those chapters. So hold off on thinking about the uses of these, but just be familiar with the form so you can recognize them. But again, it's an infinitive, so it starts with the word to. It's in the future, so we're going to say to be going to take, to be about to take. And I know that those sound awful, and you're probably thinking, when would I ever use that? Just in general, it's not a very commonly used form as an infinitive in either English or Latin. Okay, passive side, just like we've done for the last two infinitives, it's formed from the participle as well. So that participle is formed from the second principal part, which is also the future passive participle. And then again, you add the additional verb esse. And then its translation or example would be ducendus esse. And its translation would be awfully to be about to be taken. Okay. Technically, that's not our future passive infinitive, but that's the one that I will always put in the main boxes. This is something that we see only in indirect statement. Technically, your future passive infinitive is the neuter form of the future passive participle, which is ductum, plus the passive form of the verb ira, to go, ductum iri. The translation is the same. To be, I'll do this one this time, to be going, to be taken. Okay. And so this is actually your true, but I, in all the years I've done Latin, have only seen that form once entirely in Caesar. And it was also with